Welcome to another episode of the Bitter Pill. Um, Today I'm talking to my friend Bob, who and research collaborator Bob, who lives in Ontario, Canada, and thus, although he doesn't live in Ottawa, he doesn't live in North Bay, where there have also been protests, and he keeps up with the news there, which isn't necessarily very accessible here in the States. So I just wanted to get his perspective on what this convoy is all about and how Canadians feel about it, and whatever the hell else he wants to say. So welcome, Bob, and so you want to just start by giving whatever overview you want to give of what's going on there, and you know.
Well, I mean, Ottawa's been under in quotes siege for 18, 19 days now. This convoy started out as an anti-vaccine mandate convoy, mostly protesting truckers being unable to go to the United States when that's U.S. law and not Canadian law. Okay, look at you had your choice. You could go in to the States and quarantine. Well, you're going to lose money if you do that. And right, I'm listening to these people on TV, some of these truckers, and they're saying things like, well, yeah, I'm not vaccinated, so I can't work now because I can't go into the US. Like it's, well, gee, that's Canada's problem? No, it's not. It's your problem. And finally, finally the federal government invoked the Emergency Measures Act, which is a 1988 act, I believe, that replaced what was called the War Measures Act. And what it does is it restricts certain freedoms and gives police some more power. And to be honest with you, the kinds of freedoms that it restricts isn't anything that would bother you or me. Okay. What they're doing is they're giving banks the ability to freeze the accounts of people who are contributing to this siege on Ottawa. And I mean, effectively, it is a siege in the sense that people living in that area of Ottawa can't really do much. Now, what you see on television are people looking like they're having a great time, and of course they're unmasked and they're not physical distancing, and they've got bouncy castles out for the kids, which in 30 below zero weather isn't really that nice anyway. But they have a big command center set up, and there's evidence that there are former Canadian Special Forces people involved in the command center. And the command center isn't near where the rest of the trucks are. And they're using it to bring in food and fuel and that sort of thing for the truckers. But the government and the police have attempted their best to cut this off. And people might see all this merrymaking as being, somewhat innocuous, but you need to put this in the context that at the Coutts, Alberta border crossing, the RCMP discovered in a truck a huge cache of semi-automatic assault rifles and ammunitions and body armor and this sort of stuff, and have charged at least 3 people with conspiracy to commit murder. And so, I mean, you don't know what are in these trucks, and you don't know what's going on in the command center. Now, these people, it just digressed from a freedom convoy to a neo-Nazi alt-right racist, sexist too, for that matter, group of people who were harassing people who live in that area of Ottawa. Some businesses just shut down because
the whole
people
mall, the biggest mall there, shut down, right?
Yeah, they shut it down. They shut it down because the truckers were using it for refuge. Plus, they were harassing people. You know, like they did things like they went to the soup kitchen, which is, there's a Salvation Army soup kitchen that's very close to where the convoy is, and close to, fairly close to Parliament buildings. And their whole, their whole reason for being is to help the homeless and the hungry, and take you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, and piss on them. That's what the statue of bigotry says, to quote Lou Reed. But no, they're there to help people that are down and out, and the truckers were going in en masse, unmasked en masse.
Right. And that's what they did everywhere, right? That was like part of their protest, was to deliberately violate mask mandates in every business they went into.
Yep. Now, I'll tell you something that bothers me a bit about what's going on, is that in Ottawa, there's a local state of emergency. We have a provincial state of emergency. Doug Ford put that in, which is interesting because Doug was telling the truckers at one point in time, come to Ontario. I don't know.
And for Americans who don't know, Doug Ford is the premier, I believe it is, of Ontario.
Yes. Yeah, which would be like the governor of a state.
Right.
And then we had this national emergency that was also declared. And it bothers me that people see this move as government overreach when in fact it was absolutely necessary.
Well, I guess one thing that people have said is that while those measures could be used against anybody, right? So the government could theoretically go after people who, for whatever other reason, like if there's a protest against an oil pipeline or something like that. But I guess
they have gone after people who are protesting against oil pipelines.
What's that?
I said they have in the past in British Columbia.
Yeah.
In British Columbia, there was a standoff between Indigenous people and the RCMP about issues related to a pipeline project, but that wasn't federal. That was a provincial kind of issue, and it all ended up being resolved peacefully. I guess relatively so.
Yeah, and my general response to assertions like that is that, look, if there's something that threatens capitalist interests in any way, whether or not they have to invoke some emergency law or they don't, they're going to come down hard on that protest or whatever it is, regardless. And so, that's what ultimately happened here, is that eventually the blockades of the borders, which you mentioned the one Coutts, Alberta, and another one I forget where, and also the biggest one was of the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario, which was shutting down a lot of manufacturing and so
on
forth
both
in
sides of the
both
border.
Canada and the U.S.
Yeah,
So
on both sides of the border.
yeah,
And I mean, look, that's a strategically foolish move because it put things in perspective. The trucking companies don't support the truckers. The Teamsters don't support the truckers. The unions don't support the truckers. And most truckers don't support the truckers. So
exactly.
a lot of these people are unemployed or there was a guy on this morning who's on some kind of a workers' compensation disability. So he's saying, well, I'm just going to sit in my truck here. And if the police come, well, they're just like, it was a great quote. It's once they get out of their vehicle, they're just another man or woman like any other one of us. Well, you don't get it, fella. And the thing that's ludicrous is that this will push Biden more toward a buy American, build everything in the United States position, because a lot of this production in Michigan relies on what's called just-in-time reception of materials. So they don't have big warehouses where they're stockpiling parts that might be built in Oshawa or might be built in Arthur, Ontario. There's a plant there that builds parts. Well, these parts come in and they're immediately put into the assembly line. Like Ford and GM and Chrysler don't have warehouses and they don't have manufacturing capabilities for these particular parts, and they're relying on the Canadian manufacturers to get these things the hell across the Ambassador Bridge so that they can produce automobiles. And
it's I mean, from the protesters' perspective, and of course you and I completely reject their demands and who they are, but from their perspective, I mean, they wanted to disrupt commerce as a means of forcing the trying to force their demands through, but at the same time, when they did that, that brought the majority of the ruling class of both the United States and Canada, including some members of the Conservative Party in Canada, who largely had initially supported the protests. And that's important to note that it wasn't just this grassroots movement. That there were strong elements of the political establishment supporting and funding these protests, from the very beginning.
Yes.
Including the Premier of Alberta and Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Ron DeSantis and Tucker Carlson, who's selling "I Love Truckers" instead of "I Love Tucker" T-shirts on his website right now. And that dynamic changed somewhat, when this blockade went on for long enough and started disrupting things, because they were like, look, Pierre, Justin, this can't keep going on. You got to stop it. So that's what happened.
And the conservatives are now their new shtick is, well, you really didn't need to put in invoke the Emergencies Act. Well, we support what the truckers believed, but we don't think they went about it the right way. But you didn't need to invoke the Emergency Act, blah blah blah, and it's odd that the fascists are calling Trudeau a fascist. Okay,
yeah,
I mean,
that's a massive projection.
And in the United States, people were protesting in New York, in front of the Canadian consulate, calling Trudeau a socialist. I'm not, I guess when is a fascist not a fascist? I guess it's when he's a socialist. It's like, I throw my hands up. I said, it can't get any better than this. I read a newspaper article that I actually sent to you, and if it wasn't that it was real, it was funny. To be honest with you, it was funny to read. And there's some senator from Louisiana who was talking about Trudeau as the managerial elite.
John Kennedy is his name, and he's no relation to the Kennedy family, but he's, this far right dude from Louisiana, which, I mean, all of the supporters of the truckers in the United States and in Canada are members of the far right. There's not, at least in Canada, there's not any progressive or leftist groups backing this. The labor unions are against it. The indigenous people's associations are against it, and so on and so forth. And if I could just, I hope this share screen thing will work in the context of our doing this weird little, shared presentation with a background of being in, Hawaii or wherever the fuck that's supposed to be. But in reality, Bob and I are not next to each other. We're several hundred miles apart, and we are definitely not in some tropical paradise or whatever.
And I look like I'm further back from Jeff, or else I'm very small, one or the other.
Yeah, and I'm actually probably even shorter than Bob. But anyway, let me see if I can share this article here. I'm going to hit the share screen button and just go through some of the support and opposition for this.
Can I point one thing out real quick before you do that? This is something that worries me, is that
I'm not able to.
The provinces are starting to relax their mandates.
Yeah.
And the federal government, like Theresa Tam, who's in charge of Health Canada, or is the chief medical officer of Health for Canada, is starting to endorse some of these, reopening plans. Now, Ford in Ontario moved things up even more quickly. So as of today, restaurants are back to full capacity. We still have mask mandates in effect in the province of Ontario, but it varies from province to province, just like it does from state to state.
It doesn't vary from state to state anymore. I think they've almost all gotten rid of them at this point on the state level anyway. Our local community here in Bloomington, Indiana, still has a mask mandate, but they've mostly been gotten rid of in the States.
Well, but here's my worry. My worry is that the truckers are going to take credit for these loosening of mandates, when in fact the loosening of mandates have to do with how quickly our Omicron numbers have dropped.
Right.
But I'm predicting by the end of February, second week of March, we're going to be locked down again because we're going to spike.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it'll happen that quickly, but yeah, definitely if you drop all mitigations, even with Canada's 80% vaccination rate, I mean, come on, Portugal has a 90% vaccination rate, and after basically getting rid of, all measures, their Omicron spike has been massive.
Look
But
at how
yeah, I just
nasty
wanted to,
Denmark is.
yeah, Denmark too, same thing, 80% vaccination rate, but that other 20% plus, significant portion of the vaccinated people, given that A, Omicron is immune evasive, and B, the community case rates are so high that a certain proportion of the vaccinated people are going to get infected, a fairly large number of them, simply because you've got so many cases, and it's still reducing the infection rate relative to being unvaccinated. But vaccines can only do so much in the absence of other measures when you've got a virus as contagious as measles. But yeah, I just wanted to stress here that it certainly looks as though the quote unquote truckers, most of whom don't seem to be truckers, who actually have about a 90%
They aren't keeping
vaccination.
on trucking.
Yeah, I mean, if they were really truckers who
They'd
were
be trucking.
employed by a trucking company, there's no way they could take like 3 weeks off of work or whatever to do this. But anyway, my point is, it certainly looks as though the pressure of the truckers' protest has pushed, Canada's government toward relaxing their measures sooner than they would have, and that may or may not be true, but it certainly appears as if, other than the vaccine mandates, which I mean still exist in some cases and will continue to probably, but they're doing away with the mask mandates, which has been kind of a hidden demand of the protests.
Oh, it's a not so hidden demand. They want everything gone. They want absolutely everything having to do with COVID control gone.
Right. But it is, I mean, from the perspective of all these Americans who are not informed about what's going on there, and yet form these opinions in support of the protests because they are anti-vaccine mandate, and that's all they really know about them. But yeah, in fact, it's been a while since I've looked at the details of the document, but the leaders of the protests, the organizers of the protests, put together a document that called for, all these measures to be lifted, any restrictions on the spread of COVID to be lifted, basically, or else, they said the government should resign. And, it's basically, a threat to carry out a coup attempt, which, I mean, of course.
Well, that's exactly what it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what, first of all, we don't have Second Amendment rights here in Canada, just as an FYI. Okay. Right. And so finding this big cache of weapons was somewhat frightening. And in fact, several of the protesters that Coots actually, when that happened, left, and they said, you know what? This wasn't our particular point. We weren't here for violence. We were here just to make our point about our opposition to mask mandates and vaccine mandates and this sort of stuff. But we were doing it peacefully, and we don't want to be associated with these people. And as soon as the neo-Nazis showed up there, a lot of them left. So it was easy to take care of Coots. It wasn't so easy to take care of the Ambassador Bridge, but it was done. And Ottawa is a shit show.
Yeah. Yeah, there's still several hundred people and several hundred trucks there, is the last I heard. But Yeah, I just a few minutes ago tried to share screen feature to try and show folks some of the details about support and opposition to the convoy, and I couldn't get it to work for some reason. So I'll just read some stuff out to people, and I'll certainly put a link to this article that talks about this in the video description. But this is an article by a Canadian labor union activist, Tony Lee. And the first point he makes is that, like I was saying earlier, the people who are involved in the protests are largely not truckers. Because somebody who's a truck driver, either whether they own their own rig or whether they work for some company, it's not very likely that they're going to be able to take several weeks off from doing their job to do this. Especially trucking companies are very much against this protest for the most part. And neither do the union leaders of the truckers. The Teamsters Canada issued a statement opposing this. And the protests have been focused on ending all these public health measures, which certainly doesn't help truckers or anybody else. It allows for the unchecked spread of a virus that here in the United States has killed approaching 1 million people, and that's an underestimate. And I don't know what the numbers are in Canada, but it's definitely tens of thousands. Tens of thousands. I don't know if it's over 100,000.
I can tell you in about 0.2 seconds.
Yeah.
That's
a lot. Canada's about a tenth the size of the U.S., a little more than a tenth the size of the U.S. in population. And it's done a slightly better job at fighting COVID than the U.S., but still nothing to write home about.
No, I was talking to somebody last night in Sri Lanka, and Canada's 900 and some deaths per million people, and Sri Lanka is at 700. So, I mean, that's a fairly big difference. But then you look at the UK, and the UK is over 2,000, right? It's something like 2,700 deaths per million people in the UK. And what did the UK do? They just friggin' dropped everything.
Yes, I know. And Denmark and a host of other countries in Europe. About 36,000 deaths in Canada, which would translate to more than a couple 100,000 in the U.S. Close to 300,000, I guess. They're proposing to just get rid of all these measures, which is basically, and I keep trying to get this through to people, but they don't seem to listen. That the ruling class as a whole is inherently shitty on the vast majority of issues. They overthrow governments in countries. They exploit workers in poor countries. You can go down the list, but there's still different factions within the ruling class, and the faction that's supporting these so-called truckers and that supported similar protests here in the United States, that's the most right-wing faction of the ruling class. This is Republicans in the United States, progressive conservatives, just Conservative Party now, I guess, in Canada,
and the
right parties. Huh?
And the People's Party of Canada too,
Party,
which is just the alt-right of the alt-right.
Right, and then you have the Fascist Party in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, and you can just go down the list in every single country where there's a significant element of protest against not just vaccine mandates, let's bear that in mind, but also against mask mandates and against even wearing masks, because you've got these folks running around Ottawa harassing people for wearing masks and demanding that they take them off, and invading stores without masks, and threatening healthcare workers, and just on and on. Yeah, it's in every country, including the United States and Canada and many others. It's the far right that is the main driving force behind these types of protests. And so leaders and supporters of the protests, there in Canada are the most right-wing elements of the Conservative Party, the People's Party, even farther right. Western Canadian separatists, such as the Maverick Party, who want to basically split off that portion of Canada from the rest, and just have a anti-worker, anti-immigrant, anti-native Canadian, First Nations, field day, and they've attracted the support of people like Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk, and so on here in the United States. And they've just a list of some of the things they've done there in Ottawa and presumably in other places. They've vandalized homes and businesses with gay pride flags or with signs supporting vaccinations. They've bullied and harassed Ottawa citizens who were wearing masks, as we were talking about, following them and demanding they take their masks off. They threatened healthcare workers. And I think I may have said this before. Well, maybe I didn't. A lot of the supporters of these protests, who are on the left, supposedly, take the position that all cops are bastards, that because the reasoning being that the so-called good cops who aren't shooting innocent people or brutalizing people and so forth, they're looking the other way. They're not doing anything about the cops who are being bastards. And you could say the same thing about the people in these protests, that they're tolerating these violent racist bullies, racist and everything else bad, fascist bullies in their midst and in the leadership of their protest. And so if all cops are bastards, if you believe that, then why don't you apply the same logic to the participants in these protests?
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. Jason Kenney, who's the premier of Alberta, came out the other day and said, well, the Emergency Act is a bit, which gives the federal government powers over the provinces that it doesn't usually have. So it'd be like the Congress and Senate getting powers. Actually, it'd be more presidential powers, essentially.
It's essentially
all of the state powers.
For listeners, viewers in the United States, which is the vast majority of people, the few people who watch this, it'd be essentially like, I forget which amendment of the Constitution it is, but it would be like the federal government's temporarily suspending most states' rights.
And that's what it usually happens in wartime.
Right.
Is when they invoke these sorts of things. But, Jason Kennedy says, well, we really didn't need this. But like the day before, the RCMP uncovered this cache of weapons.
Right.
So, Jason, tell me, are there more caches of weapons out there, possibly? Yeah, I think that, Alberta does need this.
Mm-hmm.
People don't, I expect that he's going to lose the next election. I certainly hope Ford does too.
Yeah. Just to back up what you're saying, just to note that a broad swath of Canadians agree with your perspective, particularly those on the left. So just continuing with this article, which I'll link in the video description, some of the opposition to the protests includes the Canadian Labour Congress, which is like the AFL-CIO in the United States, the Teamsters Union, many other unions have expressed opposition to these protests and pointed out, the anti-worker and racist and right-wing, in some cases fascist politics behind the protests. You've got various indigenous First Nations groups in Canada also issuing statements condemning the protests. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in Saskatchewan, the Ontario Health Coalition, a group of healthcare professionals, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, and many others. That's all this article mentions, but I know the Communist Party of Canada is another one that comes to mind. So
well, the NDP is the NDP, which is leftist. The leader of the NDP came out, in absolute opposition to the, that's one of the three major political parties in Canada,
right,
and came out in complete opposition to the convoy and the blockades.
Yeah, so that's important to recognize. It's not just the mainstream of the political establishment that's opposing this, but it's not just the Liberal Party or the neoliberals, as we like to call these pro-capitalist but not quite fascist politicians. It's not just them; it's everybody to the left of them, and on the other hand, people to the right of them, like the Conservative Party, like the People's Party, like these white supremacist groups and fascist groups. Did I mention the Proud Boys founder, Gavin McInnes, is Canadian? And of course, the Proud Boys are very much behind this.
Yeah.
A lot of the supporters from the U.S. and literally a lot of the protesters, my understanding were people who were involved in the January 6th protests back in early 2021, where, a lot of people try to downplay it and say, well, there was no serious threat to the U.S. government or anything. And granted, that's true, but it was an attempt to, overturn the results of a U.S. Presidential election. Where
I don't know, people died. I think it was a fairly serious threat.
Yeah. There wasn't a lot of violence, but the point is that they were attempting to overturn the results of an election, which most of us on the left fucking hate Joe Biden, but that doesn't mean that we don't think he beat Donald Trump fair and square, or do think that there's any argument whatsoever for, replacing him with Donald Trump.
Which is interesting because I'm not sure who these alt-right people were proposing to replace Justin Trudeau with, and they obviously don't understand our political system.
Just to reiterate, as we mentioned earlier, these, the leaders of these protests were trying to, essentially, if they didn't get their way, overthrow the elected government of Canada. That, by the way, one of the main issues that it ran on, and they didn't win a majority of the votes, but Canada's like that with so many different political parties, and in fact, between them and the NDP, they did win a majority of voters who in Canada overwhelmingly support vaccine mandates. I think the last it's been a while since I saw a poll on that, but that poll said that for most forms of vaccine mandates, 80% or more of Canadians support vaccine mandates. Is that the sense that you get too?
Well, to be honest, is that almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody that I know has been vaxxed.
Right.
And there are a few holdouts that I know who are vaccine hesitant. And to be honest with you, I it's not that they're not conspiracy theorists, and they're not my body, my choice lunatics who those people in the U.S., most of them don't support women's reproductive rights. So I'm not sure where their my body, my choice bullshit comes from.
Well, I mean, some of them do, but I mean, their argument is so disingenuous because it's ignoring the choice of the people who are not choosing to refuse to get vaccinated.
But being vaccine hesitant makes sense if you don't know enough about the vaccine. Then you can talk to people, do research, whatever. The problem is that social media is not the right place to be doing your research, because there's far too much bullshit out there. And if you're not a scientist, it's difficult to separate the bullshit from the reality of the situation. Look, they made it. We didn't ever have a vaccine mandate in Ontario, but what we did have, and people.
Well, what do you mean by that? There weren't businesses that had mandates, or government offices.
Here's how it worked. It was what the provincial government did was make people's ability to do things so minimal if they weren't vaccinated that it was much more worthwhile to just go get vaccinated. So they put in in quotes vaccine passports because they don't use that term, but essentially you have to show that you are double vaxxed and you've got you got a little certificate like you have in the States from yours is from the CDC. Ours comes in from the federal government.
Well, CDC is part of the federal government.
Yeah, but ours, initially it was provincial. So we had a provincial card, but then they decided to standardize it because it varied from province to province. So like if somebody came in from like Alberta and showed their, who'd know if this vaccine passport was real or not, right?
Yeah.
So what they did was because health, it just like in the U.S., healthcare, although funds for healthcare come from the federal government to the provincial governments, the provincial governments decide what decisions to make about health. So what Ford did, and I'll give him credit for this, like I don't give him much credit most of the time, but I'll give him credit for phasing in this vaccine passport system where you had to show that you were double vaxxed in order to go into, for example, a restaurant. But the restaurants have been closed here during the last spike, and they reopened to 50% capacity, and today they reopened to full capacity. I'm not going to be going out to any restaurant anytime soon because these guys are ignoring the literature that shows that this stuff is aerosol and it travels at least 4 meters. So that's 12 and a half feet for my American friends.
And what people don't seem to understand is that, granted, COVID vaccines, especially now that we have more infectious, the more infectious Omicron variant that's, immune evasive, they don't guarantee that you won't get COVID, certainly. But, there's hardly any vaccines for diseases that do guarantee that you won't get the disease. And B, they prevent enough cases and severe illnesses that, it's still massively protecting people from COVID relative to not having a high vaccination rate, which
Yeah,
in countries that are vaccine hesitant, like the U.S. and not as much to an extent in Canada, but certainly in the U.S., you've got to mandate in some respects in order to achieve the high vaccination rate that you need. And I was just looking at a study that just came out from Yale University the other day, saying that they estimate that vaccines in the United States, since they were implemented, have prevented about 35 million cases of COVID, have prevented about 10 million hospitalizations, and over 1 million deaths. And that's without, very much in the way of vaccine mandates. If we got the rate up somewhere like you guys have in Canada, instead of 64% up to 80% or something, a lot of people would benefit from that.
But the guess on herd immunity is like somewhere around 95% for this particular virus. But the thing that people fail to realize all the time is that no vaccines are 100% effective. Some are more effective than others. The MMR vaccine is extremely effective, but you have to have about 90% of the population vaccinated in order to prevent outbreaks. And in France a few years ago, they had a drop from 90% just down to 89. So we're talking a 1% drop in vaccination rates, but that put them at 89% instead of 90. And they had a massive measles outbreak because someone who was not vaccinated traveled outside of France, caught measles, and brought it back into France. So, we don't. In the U.S., very few people get measles, but a couple of years ago, there was a big outbreak in a Somali community in Minnesota, in Minneapolis or St. Paul, I forget which. But this was because these people weren't vaccinated, and so they had more cases in that one pocket in the U.S. than they had in the entire rest of the U.S. Okay, It was something like 72 cases versus 11 in the rest of the U.S. for that year, right?
Yeah.
So, and like the flu vaccine is fairly effective, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to get the flu. What it means is you're going to get you're not going to have as many symptoms, and you're going to get over it much more quickly than somebody who didn't have the flu shot.
Yeah.
So, and people fail to understand that about vaccines, that vaccines work in two ways. One is they actually build up the T cells for you, and the other is that you have to have a whole pile of people vaccinated to prevent outbreaks.
Right. Yeah, that's something that people don't understand. I guess this individualistic culture we have leads people to tend to look at things only from an individual point of view. So, it doesn't occur to them that probably the more important determinant of how effective a vaccine campaign is what percentage of your population is vaccinated, rather than just what percentage of cases being vaccinated prevents people from getting relative to not being vaccinated. And, both are important, of course, but people underestimate how important it is that we get that vaccination rate of the entire population up to 90 or 95% or whatever it is. And, with Omicron or whatever equally contagious variant comes next, I would guess that'll happen. We're going to need something like 95% for vaccines to prevent most of the cases.
And
That's just the
that
way it
other
is.
thing that people don't understand too, and even epidemiologists don't seem to get it as you and I have delved into the epidemiological literature,
Yeah.
and is that these mutations are random. And so you could end up with the next variant being as contagious as Omicron, but as deadly as rabies. And so rabies, if you're not treated, it's 100% deadly.
Yeah.
100%. If you're not treated within a couple of weeks, you
Yeah.
die.
Yeah. In any case, the point that a lot of people don't understand is that as long as you have percentage-wise a fairly low fatality rate from a disease to begin with, there is no natural selection pressure on that virus to become quote unquote milder or less deadly. Omicron, in fact, happened to turn out to be not quite as deadly as Delta, but that was a random event. It wasn't because of evolutionary pressure at all. And the next variant could very well be more deadly than Delta, or more deadly or certainly more deadly than Omicron. And people do not seem to get that you can have a virus that's in the case of Omicron, maybe it's killing maybe it has a fatality rate, I don't know, 6 or 7 times as high as the flu versus 10 times or whatever it is. I'm just throwing figures out, but we know it's more deadly than a flu, but less deadly on an individual basis than some, but not all, of the earlier variants. But it's so much more contagious that, in fact, it winds up killing more people in any country that doesn't take it very seriously, which the U.S. and most of Europe haven't. And so they have seen, despite high vaccination rates, or moderately high in the case of the U.S., more deaths from Omicron than they did from Delta, simply because there's so many more cases. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Take a look at Eastern Australia. Australia fared pretty damn well throughout the entire pandemic, and then they made a sow's ear out of a silk purse. And it's interesting because Western Australia has relatively low rates, but Eastern Australia, where a lot of very right-wing individuals live, where they were having, anti-mask and anti-lockdown protests, and eventually they had to lock down, but their lockdown didn't work too well. And so if you look at the death rates in Australia, you can see a little bump from Delta, and then it just goes up massively for Omicron.
Right. Yeah. And Denmark, same thing. They got all cocky with their 80+% vaccination rate, and basically, 2 or 3 weeks ago, abandoned all other mitigation measures. Like, they don't have mask mandates anywhere. From what I understand, for instance, the kids are in in-person school, and some of them are not vaccinated, or probably a lot of them. Within just a few weeks, their death rates have skyrocketed, and they're now at a death rate that's on a par with many less vaccinated countries, because they're not doing anything else, and those other countries are. So,
Well, I mean, and it's something that you and I have been discussing throughout this entire pandemic, is that behavioral interventions have more impact than medical interventions. By the time you're intubated, you're at death's door. Right? I mean, and people are failing to get the fact that wearing your mask, staying away from people outside of your social bubble, and locking down are good things.
Yeah.
And there are several countries that have done exactly that and fared quite well throughout the pandemic.
Yeah.
China's a good example. Vietnam's a good example. Thailand's a good example. Thailand just got whacked a little bit by Omicron.
Yeah.
You know, a lot, like, essentially from research that you and I have done, we've shown that Asia from west to east and the Pacific Islands have fared very, very well in general.
And within countries, just to drive home the point we're trying to make here, that the far right, as opposed to the right, the Democrats in the U.S. and the liberals in Canada, for the most part, they're kind of center right parties. But the far right are the ones that are driving this opposition to vaccines and to masks and to lockdowns and so on and so forth in every country. And then, in the United States, you and I did research where we showed that the states that voted for Trump or had a large Trump voting share, had much higher infection and death rates than the states that voted for Biden. And not that voting for Biden is an indication of any great political understanding, but the point is that if you look at polls on who supports and who opposes things like vaccine mandates and mask mandates and so forth, the opposition is overwhelmingly coming from people who say that they're Republican. Similarly, we found similar results in Canada, where the more conservative provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan were where the main opposition to stricter COVID measures is coming from.
We had Ontario, Quebec. Right now, oddly enough, one of the places in Canada that's getting whacked pretty hard case-wise is Northwest Territories and Nunavut, and they are led by more collectivist kind of governments. But the problem is that there's all sorts of mining that goes on up there, and these places lay directly above Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, right?
Yeah.
So all these workers are coming in and bringing COVID with them.
Exactly. Yeah. We want to stress that there are a whole lot of factors involved. And at this particular moment, probably the biggest factor of all in accounting for, cases and deaths is, simply how much Omicron you've got in your country or your province or whatever. Regardless of their, vaccination rate or whatever else, countries that are not being super strict about it, like, China, for example, or New Zealand, where you can't even come into the country unless you quarantine for a couple of weeks and they make sure you're not infected. Other than countries like that, the main thing that's happening is that people are getting whacked with Omicron. Eventually it evens out. So Omicron hits different parts of the world in different waves. And over time, you see that other factor is important. But Omicron is just so contagious that, it kind of drives things at this point in the pandemic.
Yeah. And my worry, and this is my embarrassment, I guess, about being from the West, is that we really need to be providing mRNA vaccines to developing nations around the world. And, if you look at India, for example, India has ramped up its vaccination program tremendously. But you've got a population of 1.4 billion people, so the raw number of infections is pretty high.
Yeah.
And when you have a high raw number of infections, that's where you're going to get mutations.
Yep.
And so, I mean, we need to be shipping every vaccine we possibly can to places like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Brazil, and nipping this in the bud. Because if we don't, this is the new normal.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I don't like it.
Exactly. We're not going to get rid of this until we, achieve a high vaccination rate worldwide, which in recalcitrant countries like the United States or some others, is going to take vaccine mandates in some form, and do other things and not just rely on vaccines. We're not going to need to mandate masks, make high quality masks available for everybody. Have like capacity limits or outright temporary and compensated closures of restaurants or other places that are sort of high risk settings, including schools. Or this is just going to keep coming back. This delusion that just because we're on the downswing of the Omicron wave and now we're only quote unquote on a par with some of the highest levels of new infections a day of the Delta variant. I mean, come on, this isn't a time to be dropping everything. But
no, not at all. And this is what's worrying me in Ontario is that this full capacity at restaurant things it is foolish. And the other thing that get back to your mask issue is they have the students back in class now.
Yeah.
But they're doing something really foolish, is that if a kid tests positive on a antigen test, so rapid test, they're having them isolate for 5 days instead of 10 days.
Yeah.
So we know that after a positive antigen test, it can be 10 or a couple more days than that before you're no longer contagious. So they're sending contagious kids back to school.
Yeah.
Now, they gave the teachers N95 masks, and that protects the teachers from the students, but it doesn't protect the students from each other. And the most recent article that I read about cognitive decline as a function of being unvaccinated and getting COVID was 20% of people. So one in five will experience
and about 1 in 5 with long COVID in general.
Yeah. And so without kids being vaccinated, you're talking about reducing the cognitive capabilities of these kids, and for we don't know how long. So far, it's a long time.
Yeah. And if I could just kind of bring this back somewhat to our main topic here, and maybe we should kind of wrap up and save extended discussion of other issues for another time. But I mean, what Bob was just talking about, exemplifies the fact that COVID is a risk for everyone. Not just for older adults like me and Bob, who are both, over 60 years old. I'm 60 exactly, plus a few months. But for everyone, because kids, for example, have a very high rate of developing long COVID. There's more than 100,000 kids who are suffering from it right now, meaning they've had COVID symptoms or symptoms stemming from their COVID infection for months, and in a few cases years. At a rate of something like 10% of the kids who get infected, and it's a higher rate than that for adults, even young adults. So it's not just people dying that we have to be concerned about, but there's all sorts of negative effects that it can occur as a result of getting infected with COVID, even if you're a young and, as far as healthy person. And so, there's just so much denial about this. Like, all people who are, on the side of the protesters, whether they're far right themselves or they just think that way about restrictions on their quote unquote freedom, they are exclusively focused on deaths and ignore all the other serious negative consequences of COVID, including the fact that, for example, kids who most of the time emerge relatively unscathed from a COVID infection, they can pass it on to someone else who is more vulnerable than they are, obviously, especially as contagious as Omicron is. So it is a threat to every single one of us, regardless of our age and our health and anything else. And people are in denial about that. And then, not only do they just focus on deaths, but then they minimize the deaths by, only focusing on the percentage of people who die. Well, guess what? 3 or 4% or whatever it is of, the tens of millions of infections with Omicron that we've seen just here in the United States or, in Canada, is a lot of people. And, we had 60,000 people die just last month in the U.S. And these people, then they say, well, a lot of them had pre-existing conditions. Well, fuck you. I'm 60 years old. That's a pre-existing condition as far as COVID is concerned. I don't want to fucking die or get seriously ill or whatever. I want to live to be my life expectancy, which since I've made it this far is probably at least somewhere in the mid 80s. Because it changes the more you make it past the hurdles of earlier in your life. But these people, they'll say things like that, or I saw this bozo Fiorella, who's a YouTuber who's very anti-vax, claiming that in Italy, instead of 150,000 deaths from COVID, they've actually had more like 3,000, and the others weren't really from COVID; they were from pre-existing conditions or comorbidities or whatever, and claimed that the Italian government had said that. And then if you go to the Italian health department's website, of course that's not what you find. You find, about 150,000 people are believed to have died of COVID. And, if anything, we're underestimating the number of deaths from COVID. And if anything, we're underestimating all the other consequences, really bad consequences like serious illness and long COVID and so forth, that can happen from COVID. So there's just this, don't look up perspective that's currently pervading much of the populace. You see it in the media, you see it certainly from the far right and from all those people who are basically opposing us taking measures to get this under control, as China has done, as New Zealand has done, and they say things like, well, everybody's going to get it. Well, guess what? If everybody gets it,
lots of people die.
You're looking at a society that can't function because so many people are too disabled to fucking work. Plus, all of them, so many of them will die. Like if, like even if it's only 0.1% that are dying, if 0.1% of 330 million people or 38 million or whatever it is in Canada is still a hell of a lot of people who die, and then all the other consequences too. So we got to look up.
Jeff, the other thing is, in Canada, because we have universal health care, no one is going to be denied health care if they've had COVID. in the
Right.
U.S., things have changed because you can't be denied health insurance
Healthcare,
because
yeah.
of a pre-existing condition, but they can certainly make it much more expensive for you so that it's unaffordable,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. The average hospital bill for people hospitalized with COVID in the United States is $20,000, and
Yeah,
I'm guessing the average hospital bill of people hospitalized with COVID in Canada is $0. So
that's right.
yeah,
That's exactly right.
yeah,
And the they're starting to say, well, look at our RCU admissions are starting to come down. We might be able to do elective surgeries again, that sort of thing. But what they're
Mhm.
calling elective in Canada is like
Operating on your
radiation
tumor.
or
Yeah,
chemotherapy for cancer, bypass surgery, this sort of thing, right? Because the COVIDiots, and this is what it is 85% of the people that are in the ICUs right now are there for COVID, and about 98% of them are unvaxxed.
yeah. I don't know if it's 98%, but it's definitely more than 90.
Yeah. And yeah, I was just throwing out a
Yeah,
hyperbolic number,
yeah. I
but
mean, if
it
you
is over 90. It is
yeah,
over
if you
90.
calculate just based on the raw numbers, it's going to be not quite so lopsided because, of course, 80% of people in Canada are vaccinated. But if you go by rates, like per 100,000 or per million, the odds of being hospitalized are much, much, much higher if you're not vaccinated.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
And I'll bring this back around to the truckers again. I took my
yeah,
mom for a drive to get her out of the house, and it was the day that the convoy was supposed to go through, and so there were people all along the highway. And we were driving, and then we went through a little town called Sturgeon Falls, Ontario, and there are people on both sides of the streets. And I got my window down, and I'm yelling COVIDiots at them.
yeah,
And my mom's got her window down, and she's nicely telling them that they're wrong.
yeah,
She said, said I remember when we got rid of diphtheria and polio and that sort of thing, and you're wrong. So,
yeah. Yeah, that's the thing that people don't realize is that this this is not a new thing where we have a situation where we're faced with a deadly virus that's massively spreading through the population. We're trying our damnedest to get people to get vaccinated, and some people are refusing. And you back at the turn of the 20th century, like early 1900s, smallpox was rampant in the United States, and there was a lot of protest against requiring people to get smallpox vaccinations, which are they're very effective. Probably a little more effective against smallpox than COVID vaccines are against COVID. Although COVID vaccines have a good chance of preventing you from getting infected and a much better chance of preventing you from getting seriously ill or dying. But in any case, so Massachusetts implemented a vaccine mandate for everyone, all adults, I think it was, and I guess school children too. I'll have to go back and look. Were required to get vaccinated, and so this became a famous court case. And basically the courts ruled that when there's a public health emergency, your government, state or local or whatever, has every right to implement a vaccine mandate to you bring the public health emergency under control, because bottom line is that keeping people alive and healthy is more important than this in the grand scheme of things trivial right to refuse to get vaccinated, which it's not really a right, unless you're somebody who there's good reason to believe, medically speaking, is going to have a substantial adverse reaction to the vaccine.
and
But
those
in
are
that
very,
case,
very few.
yeah, very few. And in that case, And, it turns out this is true, that people who can't get vaccinated or who can get vaccinated, but they're, more vulnerable anyway, in spite of that, to severe consequences from getting infected with a disease, they are typically very much in favor of mandating that everybody else get vaccinated to protect them.
Sure. I mean, I have a friend in Sudbury who is immunocompromised, and she relies on the herd to protect her. And so, like during flu season, like she could die from getting the flu. Okay, I mean, she's young too. I mean, she's probably in her mid 30s, and late 30s maybe. I don't know. Been anyway. She has a couple of kids. She's immunocompromised, and she's got to be really careful during flu season. And she relies. Now, this is before COVID was even on the picture. Okay, right. She had to be very careful and rely on people getting flu shots so that she didn't get sick and die. And well, now that we've got COVID, she's in an even worse position when you've got people who became so vociferous in terms of their anti-vax views based on no data whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. But anyway, just to conclude, I mean, not just in Canada, not just in the United States, but throughout the Western world, not all, but the vast majority of the opposition to policies, whatever they are, be they vaccine mandates or mask mandates or lockdowns, which is kind of an umbrella term for measures other than masks and vaccines to control COVID. They're opposed to all of it, and so they don't care to propose any alternatives to keep COVID in check to the things they're opposed to, and then in fact they minimize the consequences of COVID. So they are basically advocating mass death and suffering that's disproportionately targeted at certain groups of people, including elderly people or even moderately older people like myself and Bob. People of color who are much more likely to be, or poor people who are much more likely to be frontline workers and more exposed to COVID than the rest. Young children who may be unlikely to die from COVID, but they still do, and kids aren't supposed to die. And most of them are not vaccinated, and so on and so forth. Immunocompromised people. These are the people who, these people who are opposed to all these things don't give a flying fuck about. And I think that the rest of us need to say, well, wait a minute, we do care about them. We are our brothers or sisters' keeper to an extent. We need to stop being a society where we only look out for ourselves, and become more of one where we look out for each other. So thanks for watching today. I look forward to seeing you next time, and goodbye from Bloomington, Indiana, and North Bay, Ontario, Canada.